Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to all of you for being here. This is an important topic. It's an especially important topic to those of us from the western United States who have to live with the consequences of this issue. As I mentioned earlier, and as Ms. Clark mentioned at length in her testimony, Utah has done an extraordinary job at managing these competing interests, at balancing the need to protect the sage grouse while at the same time maintaining an environment in which our economy can grow and where economic activity can occur in a responsible fashion. I'm worried, though. I'm worried that Utah's federal partners have been showing a pronounced propensity to ignore suggestions made by the state. And when this happens, trust between the state and its citizens on the one hand, and the federal government and its agencies and its regulators on the other hand, tends to erode. When that trust tends to erode, it becomes far more difficult for us to achieve what we want to achieve. It becomes far more difficult for us to protect the bird, and it becomes far more difficult for us to accomplish all the things all the goals, the aspirations that we have in common. Now, on May 29, 2015, just over a year ago, the BLM and the Forest Service released their proposed land use plan amendments. Now, Utah seized on this opportunity and submitted a substantial comment, making many dozens of suggestions about how best to manage the sage grouse in Utah. Utahns know well how to deal with this within our own state. After all, Utahns have to live with the consequences of any efforts in those areas. So in light of that, Mr. Lyons, I'd like to ask you a question. Do you know how many of those suggestions, the suggestions that were made by the state of Utah, submitted by the state of Utah, do you know how many of those were adopted in the September 9th, 2015 final record of decision?
Well, Senator, I think I'd make 2 points. One is I'd have to go back and I'd have to talk with the state officials and others with regard to the nature of the requests for changes in the plans and how they responded. And I would also point out that many changes were made in the plans in collaboration with the state before those final drafts were issued. So I want to make clear that many issues were resolved before we got to that point. There may have been other issues that were raised in the consistency review, which is what I assume you're referring to, but I'd have to check with staff to see what changes were made both before and subsequent to the consistency review.
Okay. I'm going to ask Ms. Clark to give her perspective on this and on the point that you made at the moment. My understanding is that your answer to that question could be very simple. It's zero, none, not one of them. Not one of the suggestions made by the state of Utah submitted to the federal government were followed. Not a single one of them. Now, this is incredibly frustrating. I like to think that my state has earned a seat at the table, not only because it's affected by this in a way that most states are not, but also because my state has spent upwards of $50 million trying to figure out how to protect the sage grouse. $50 million. That is a lot of money for a small, not terribly wealthy state in the Rocky Mountains. And they've spent this just studying the sage grouse and trying to get this right. Now, it's not as though we've just thrown that money out there just to spend it. It's not as though we've wasted it. I mean, these efforts have had a pretty good effect. I mean, the sage grouse population in Utah has, as I understand it, increased by over 50% just since 2013. To have every single one of Utah's land use plan suggestions categorically rejected and not incorporated, it makes your agencies appear aloof and unresponsive, unconcerned about the dynamic of the state-federal partnership. And this state-federal partnership, this is a dynamic that I'm constantly told exists between federal land use managers on the one hand and state and local officials on the other hand. And yet, curiously, at least within my own state, I hear that only from the federal officials. I never hear the state officers describe it that way, because more often than a partnership, it's much more of a dictatorial relationship. So, Ms. Clark, I'd like to ask you, had the BLM and had the Forest Service adopted at least some of Utah's land use amendment suggestions, what effect would those changes have made on the state of Utah and on the state of Utah's ability to protect the bird?
Utah's plan and our many recommendations to the federal government were based on a directive that we had as we adopted the plan, and that was to make sure we were taking good care of the bird, conserve the bird, but also protect economic opportunity. That wasn't an easy balancing act, but we did a remarkable job with it. One thing we did is identify 11 separate areas where we created individual plans focused on the local threat. So we have used incredibly good science as we go through this. We think we could have held on to that balance and wouldn't have had to say no to so many things had we been able to really have some of our recommendations accepted. One other thing is, had they been accepted, Utah probably wouldn't be in litigation with the federal government over these plans right now.
What became of those suggestions, though, while we're on that topic?
We had a lot of discussion with the federal government. They were available to talk. The frustration was we had a lot of talk, and then the federal government did what they wanted to do.
Okay, thank you. I see my time's expired.